Who are you all, and what is it exactly that you do?
We pursue a sacred science reserved for the few. It has been known for a long time, and for the better portion of said time, was not available but to the privileged. There are those in the not-so-distant past who saw it necessary to pull back the curtain, acknowledge the existence of groups who took up the practice, and explained in depth what had previously lay hidden, revealing all but the modus operandi. Kind of like the technology but not the code. And now with this exposure, illuminating a history richer than most would guess, was shown a power on par with that of the deep cosmos. But there have arisen clones, and worse yet, bastardizations of the arts in which we have come to know. These adaptations entertain crowds, console the distressed, manipulate the naive, and fall short of offering to the earnest seeker certain truths that lie unlocked waiting for realization. Our work utilizes an ancient knowledge perpetuated by the greats.
Can you explain this science?
There are states of consciousness which transcend the normal, and when these states prevail, we can discern forms of existence which normally we have no contact. We have all heard of or perhaps experienced byproducts of this process, like déjà vu, premonition from a dream, telepathy, intuition, seeing something unexplained by conventional science. All of these examples are sightings of metaphorical tips of icebergs, but some groups know the full magnitude and more importantly how to utilize it. Some turn to experiment, poking and prodding in the obscure corners with demonstrated effects, and some turn to tradition, cracking open the door of the hidden library full of special items and wise curators to help. This is the secret knowledge. It can be defined as an extension of psychology dealing with little-known aspects of the human mind. While it may deal with abstract things, we must approach it as objectively as possible. Like religion, it is beyond conventional science, but unlike common religion, it does not rely on faith. It relies on experiences beyond the corporeal world, and we call this space the inner planes. We believe that truth itself is the highest religion, and realizations must be based on actualities. My initial concern was charlatans in the field, but then I likened it to a play with puppets and realized it wasn't to deceive but portray. In the final act, the curtains drew, and we were left to behold an empty shrine. There is no God in the popular sense, but there is a logos, and only when meditating in an empty shrine can one apprehend it. And this is exactly the difference between what we realized versus what we thought. We thought the innermost shrine contained the God, but it was revealed to us that the God is within.
So you feel the need to defend the integrity of your work. Let's say some of the threats you perceived were misunderstood. If that is the case, then where is the concern?
Once again, we venture into the abstract, but we know the effects are very real. You see, the inner planes are not objective reality, but made from the collective objective imagination. Imagination alone can bring some very concrete things. Secret knowledge comes from the discovery of different states of consciousness in which one can become aware and gain control of one's own mind. Do you see where I'm going with this? Unfortunately, there are those who use this power for bad. That is why the most noble cause could be defending the greater good and helping usher into collective consciousness the greater degrees of realization.
You describe this secret knowledge as if it is a tool with powerful effects. On what scale would you say this applies? For those wielding this power, how far does their influence reach?
The secret knowledge has greatly influenced ancient civilizations, but more importantly, our own. Once again, on a small scale, we hear stories of ectoplasm, psychometry, clairvoyance, telepathy, divination, mystical experiences, conversion, trance and rapture, hypnotism, suggestion, autosuggestion, the survival of bodily death, and last but not least, certain forms of mental disease. These are the ghost stories you hear from sailors back in port. On a larger scale, the greater body of knowledge from which these things derive is understood by the type of people who forge whole societies. To them, the experiences on the inner planes are treated as art. I would like to point out that while we live in the modern era, the age of reason did not necessarily disprove the validity of the secret knowledge, but may support it. Sacred science now may be the link between psychology and religion. We can approach mystical experiences with our intellectual minds. For that reason, our pursuit should not be for intellectual curiosity alone. We must have a desire for light on a spiritual level. But narrow is the way, and like the 16th century Rosicrucians knew, an angel with a flaming sword guards the gate. There will come a point when the reader starts to experience the subtle. You must either turn back or be prepared to answer the question, what do you want?
You are talking about inner experiences in abstract realms. How can you call it a science that relies on quantifiable data? What's your process?
There are two opponents of the sacred science who are actually on opposite ends of the spectrum: the doubtful materialist and the eccentric imposter. The doubtful materialist accepts only empirical data. The eccentric imposter will believe anything. In our pursuit of truth, we must wade through less than tangible spheres, yet judge wisely to remain objective. There are two necessities for experiments. One, the absolute faith during the experiment, and two, the ability to be critical and non-biased in consideration of the results. When these esoteric groups go to work, the group's collective faith boosts the person playing point to higher ground. Once they gain their footing, they can exercise their focus and pull the group's collective consciousness up to higher planes along with them. As soon as the experiment is complete, the experimenter should become a scientist again and examine the results in the cold light of science. Treating this work like science, we observe two types of data or proof to be examined: the objective and subjective type. Objective proof comes from direct observation. Subjective proof uses intuition. Both can be reliable if properly counterchecked.
Even with me supposing a person's intuition comes from some extrasensory organ that science has yet to explain, how can you know the data is solid? Can you explain the process?
I come from a background in psychology and found those approaches work well. I've broken this topic of subjective proof down to three types. 1, intuition. 2, conscious psychism. And 3, subconscious psychism. Intuition comes from a type of subconscious meditation. The subject does not realize the gears are turning, but they receive the signal. Conscious psychism is perception by the subtle senses. We're dealing with fine gears here, and the subject is sensitive enough to hone in on the faint signals. Subconscious psychism is the perception of things that don't quite make it to one's consciousness, where the higher sense organs are not developed enough to fully recognize these things. So these perceptions end up being lumped in with intuition. It should not be far-fetched to say we can explore techniques to analyze subconscious data. Freud did this in his psychoanalysis of dreams by means of free association. The difference here is dreams deal with the subconscious, where psychic visions deal with the superconscious. Using Freudian techniques, we can take this downloaded data the subject received from the superconscious, process the symbols revealed through free association, and shed some light in an otherwise abstract corner of human consciousness.
Listening to this, I'm picturing a person with special gifts in receiving what you describe as faint signals. You seem to explain the specific science you conduct as a group effort. How do you find these gifted individuals? Are they rare?
Let me clear something up. Clairvoyance is not needed to penetrate the unseen. Meditation can be the tool. This meditation takes 2 steps. 1, free association where the subject relaxes and allows seemingly random imagery or words to float up from the depths. And 2, direct reverie, where the subject employs a type of daydreaming in similar fashion. We all have this material from the inner self. It's just a matter of developing the tools to access it. The subconscious mind contains everything that the conscious mind has forgotten, and we believe these memories go back further than many would realize. As practitioners of the sacred science, we seek to gain access to the hall of learning. I think most secret knowledge in the past was gathered this way. This knowledge and the means to access it was traditionally passed down through initiatic orders. Some people were born with a natural ability to do this, but others had the conviction to find the schools and develop access to the higher states. Nonetheless, both instances are rare. But once again, it's absolutely important to countercheck what we take away from these experiences. It is truth in which we are after. I think modern science can play a part here. I liken it to the mythological Atlantis. What was once limited to the study of ancient writings, oceanographers can explore by using the latest technology. Simply put, I'm advocating the use of things like modern psychology in exploring the metaphorical Atlantis of the mind.
Interesting. So we're talking about human consciousness here and the role tradition plays. Does this secret knowledge deal exclusively with the mind? Does it reach out beyond the inner experience?
Confining it within would be a misrepresentation in a sense. As the famous axiom says, as above, so below. We are interested in God's generator like we are interested in man's light bulb. The ancients knew of this microcosm-macrocosm relationship and turned to nature to understand their own intricacies. This is where things like astrology come in. Of course, it takes a lifetime to properly study something like astrology. It would be better to seek a person with this type of expertise than self-dabble incompetently. Astrology is the mapping of cosmic forces in which we are subject to. Picture a boat with a primitive sail, a mat on a pole, if you will. You can only catch the wind in one direction. Manual labor is your only alternative. Now picture a boat with a rigged sail, complete with tackle and pivot points. You could almost sail straight into a headwind. Such is knowing the function and timing of the cosmic forces. The macrocosm of the universe is ordered by God, but the microcosm of his own nature, man should aim to make himself the deity. Is it not written, "Ye are all gods"? Initiation develops the God within, so the initiate may rule the microcosm of their own nature instead of leaving it the prey of chaos and old night. They become the advanced vessel. An initiate will know the planetary influences and use things like ceremony to harness or neutralize their inevitable flow. We are talking about a charting and navigation of external currents. It does not have to be overly complicated either. A simple example would be refraining from constructive work during a destructive phase. A more complex example would be using talisman to use one planetary force against another. A talisman serves as a focus point in one's own mind. It's nothing more than a mental aid. For this reason, it is better to make your own talisman than have one made for you, but I digress.
What about reincarnation? Do you think this is a thing?
We are all developing, all in transit, going from one place to another. Like other things, if we are to include reincarnation in our esoteric encyclopedia, we have to be prepared to defend the misuse and abuse of the concept. Just as any medicine which is strong enough to cure is also strong enough to poison if wrongly used. One problem I see is when the idea of past lives is romanticized and left open to abuse by frauds. Just like with the expanded perspectives we seek, and looking objectively at subjective data, we must countercheck claims of past lives. To do this, we must first consider the mechanisms at play. Every action, feeling, or thought is stored in the universal ether. Data is not stored haphazardly, but linked together in sequence, and a single image can pull out a whole chain. It is the absence of a clue which presents the difficulty. Such a starting point can be awakened in a dream, visiting a place, or reading a book dealing with the distant period in question. One problem I see is people restless with an ordinary existence wishing for grand past lives, creating fantasy in the name of vision. This is an issue with ego. You see examples like those who claim to have found their soulmate, often an illicit romance, usually somebody else's spouse. They buy into this narrative for one reason or another, that they were lovers in a past life. They may have been experiencing a certain level of emotional starvation in their marriage and latched on to an idea of past love as psychological justification. Those familiar with esoteric knowledge do consider past lives, but those with morals would not falsely use it in justifying illicit behavior. Even if the wed couple were spiritually unmated, nothing, even in the karmic realm, would justify infidelity. The memory of past lives are hidden from the common person for good reason. Individuals not developed enough would only abuse this knowledge to justify their transgressions, instead of working through them.
I come across a lot of information on astrology, numerology, and ceremony and find it hard to understand. Take numerology, for instance. I understand the use of numbers as a tool in universal language. But how far should we look into finding meaning in these things? Couldn't one find meaning in anything if they looked hard enough?
These arts have been put under the test of time. I use test in the literal sense because not only theory, but results are of particular interest. That is when it becomes a science. Initiates have always placed great importance on number, color, sound, and form. These correspondences are not to invoke forces into manifestation. That is the view of the profane. But by the adept, they are used as focal points to raise their consciousness to the level of a particular force on the inner planes. It is through the adept's own nature that the force comes down, not through a so-called magical object. The value does not lie in the material object, but in the train of thought it evokes. Kabbalists found potencies in subtle existence and made formulas involving these potencies, based on a number-letter system. This numerical language aided in the pronunciation of these formulas and became a sacred language like Sanskrit, which was evolved for the same purpose. While there are brilliant examples of numerology, not every system is of good integrity. There have been botched attempts. I came across a team of researchers using Hebrew formulas on what they called pyramid numerology. That's the deciphering of a supposed mathematical language that lay hidden in the measurements of sacred sites like the Great Pyramid. All temples of the mysteries were symbolic structures. If we want to understand their meaning, we must examine the symbolism used, from the robes of the Magi to the number of lights on the altar. The symbolism is often used as a macrocosm-microcosm representation. Christians use the cross, pagans stone circles. Worshippers of the Great Mother use caves or crypts. All symbols are well known in analytical psychology. The Book of Revelation is another topic of symbolic speculation, written by a Christian Kabbalist. 666, or the Mark of the Beast, has been projected on certain individuals throughout the years, but the sacred teachings delivered by God to man deals with spiritual principles, not persons. The true way of penetrating the future is by identifying the causes at hand. Events take form on the inner planes way before they actually happen. The illegitimate way is to put the clock forward and see events as if they've already happened. This is simply not the case. A seer can penetrate the inner planes and see events brewing and relay that information as prophecy. There is no such thing as predetermination, only tendency. Nothing is set in stone, and tenacity will snatch victory from what was an inevitable defeat. He can who thinks he can is a profound saying of those in the esoteric know.
If this sacred science is to be viewed as a tool, is it possible it could be used as a weapon? Let's say someone with knowledge who doesn't have your best interest in mind. How would someone learning the art ward off such threats?
A high initiate once said to me, 2 things are necessary for safety in this work: right motives and right associates. Good intentions are not good enough. The person who goes it alone, slow and steady, is in better shape than those who banded together under a bad leader. The psychology of the group mind is only beginning to be understood by orthodox science. Master Jesus said, If 2 or 3 gather together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. When one joins any group, they come under the influence of its group mind, and that is equally true with nefarious ones. We also shoulder our share of group karma. You may think that you could go into a society and receive its good and ignore its evil, but that is not the case. Its tone will influence you in ways unknown to yourself. Problems becoming a pattern must be identified and corrected. It is necessary to bring the error to light, not cover it up or ignore it, lest the cancer grows. In the past, nefarious groups known as tainted spheres were identified by advanced occultists and closed down. An esoteric society that has had a scandal in its midst must do everything it can from becoming a tainted sphere. Close down, scatter the brethren, let the smoke clear. 1 year, 7 years, whatever it takes. Build a new temple on new ground with new robes, symbols, jewels, or whatever. Treat it as the plague. Members of a fraternity may be called upon to fight evil in high places. And to that I'll say this. Never attempt to fight the magician unless you are of higher degree. Put up the sword and invoke the Christ. Turn upon evil the flaming sword of Pentecost. In fighting black occultism, take the higher ground. Come as a healer. If attacked on the mental plane, hold fast on the spiritual. An unwavering spirit will prevail in the long run. As the passage says, "Be still and know that I am God." Here in the West, we invoke the name of Jesus, not as some magical phrase, but in actual knowing. And by that litmus test, the devil is exposed.
When I think about exclusive groups fixated on some kind of higher purpose, whether it be individual enlightenment or claims of advancing society, I think about all the examples of abuse and cult-like behavior more often than not centered around some sort of charismatic leader manipulating any vulnerable participants. What are your thoughts on control in the name of salvation?
Well, this is one of the things we are up against. Those taking up the great work do exercise a certain level of stealth. The work itself does come across as odd to the profane, and the teachings are passed down from adept to initiate as a system of hierarchy. But there's a difference between guidance and control. A teacher with their enhanced vision may point out obstacles but should refrain from micromanaging, lest they obstruct the pupil's growth. A teacher's place is to serve, and the demand for blind obedience should be met with skepticism. The very nature of the work hinges on free thought, and this goes back to choosing your circles wisely. The pupil could only judge the teacher by results, and no one should demand faith without proof. These are the questions that should be asked when choosing associates. Do they bring forth fruits of the Spirit? Is their life Christ-like? Are they erratic in their thoughts? Have unchecked emotions, untidy and dirty in their environment? Keep a company of questionable characters? A pupil should pray for the guiding hand of God and beware of those who demand absolute obedience, especially when it involves an unlimited oath. A wise man will no more take that oath than they would write a blank check.
You will know them by their fruits. Wise words. Speaking of goals and bringing results into fruition, can you describe the aim of this science? If it produces real things, will there not be a type of bidding war amongst those in power?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Our goal is to establish contact with the higher intelligence of the inner planes. This power should not be used for political aims or as an instrument exclusive to rulers. I think rather it could be used for the application of principles like immigration or healthcare reform, for example, but should stay out of influencing legislation to bring it forward. Political activities are a terrible temptation to the practitioner of the sacred science. They must harness their sword like Peter, lest they run ahead of the times and cause more harm than good. Spiritual zeal has shed just as much blood as worldly ambition. A practitioner must choose between being a teacher of spiritual things and a leader in the affairs of the world. They cannot be within and without the veil at the same time. If they do, they will find their brilliance clouded and lose the small voice in which got them there. Those involved with spiritual matters enter sensitive states. Getting involved with political matters is the last place they want to be. Watch out for circles mixing these two things. You will get used instead of trained. It is obedience to divine principles which should be followed, not obedience to persons or systems. After all, it is the higher self that brings one into initiation.
Why is it necessary to be so secretive? You describe this as a science, and it seems like the intentional obscurity fuels misrepresentations from the outside. Why all the mystery?
The very word occult means hidden, and the mysteries have always been closely guarded. For one, our predecessors of past times faced dangerous persecution. Another reason is rulers have always sought to weaponize it for power, and each time this happened, it meant the corruption and downfall of the mysteries. Times have changed, and more has been revealed in the open, but only as much as the mass can handle. 50 years ago, the experiment was tried of giving out the theory behind the secret knowledge, and Helena Blavatsky was the messenger. She revealed the general philosophy and cosmology, but reserved the modus operandi, that is, the actual methods behind it. To understand the mechanics, you have to keep in mind that we are talking about the power of the mind and the art of magic. Just as a builder uses tools like tackle for heavy lifting, so does a magician in his rituals and words of power find ways to gain focus and leverage. The formula of this science is no more bizarre than a formula of mathematics. When a reputable order gives its degrees to an initiate, it is giving a table of logarithms corresponding with planes in which the degree is concerned. These are the practical aspects Blavatsky withheld and kept inside the temple. Only the philosophy was introduced to the public sphere. And this was for good reason. If the sacred science is powerful enough to raise the mind, it is powerful enough to destroy it. It is reserved for those worthy enough to receive it, but suitable pupils are hard to find. Likewise, teachers are not easily found. And with that, I will say this to the aspiring student. We find a master on the inner planes before we are assigned a teacher on the outer.
Can you tell me about the left-hand path?
Those who are interested in the work will find constant warnings of the left-hand path, things like black magic or dark initiators. It's important not to sweep these aspects under the rug, but to understand them, lest evil creeps in and grabs hold of what we value. There are two types of black practitioners, those who sought it purposely and those who stumbled into it unknowingly. Luckily, the Christs of evil are as rare as the Christs of good. The initiate of the right-hand path is God-centered. The initiate of the left-hand path is self-centered. The left-hand path initiator seeks to use their pupils, and they employ shortcuts in achieving elevation. These shortcuts can put the voyager in dangerous situations. Astral contact can be formed at the very first experiment. The voyager can find themselves in deep oceans without the proper development had. Hypnosis also applies. Hypnosis is especially dangerous because it's not an organic personal experience to the patient, but channels through an administrator and their filters. The black practitioner ensnares their victim through the victim's own weak nature. I will leave it at this. People found in these relationships should be approached with caution.
So with this knowledge comes a responsibility to use it wisely. You said that groups should be judged by their motives and the principles they work towards. What is your take on controversial topics like blood sacrifice seen in the movies, or the rumors of sexual abuse associated with the elite?
With any power, you have the potential for abuse. And once you understand the science behind it, you understand the magnitude of its proliferation. The Kundalini lays at the base of the spine and usually expresses itself through physiological means. but this force can be redirected in ways that can greatly aid in one's working on the inner planes. This is done by transforming emotional forces into spiritual ones. This charges a type of psychic battery. The black occultist is often absorbed in their own physical vices and leeches other people's spiritual forces by way of their kundalini force. The black occultist, with this residual stolen energy, will then trade with other parasitic experts. Going back to the left-hand path, those practitioners abuse the natural dynamic of sex and energy. One example is certain neo-pagan groups seeking young girls to charge with magnetism without the framework of marriage. Another example is cult leaders who manipulate and induce gullible girls to concentrate their emotions on him. In either case, the goal is accumulating and using energy on the inner planes taken from others. Cruelty and blood sacrifice also plays a part. Any strong emotion is a source of astral energy, and fear and pain are no exceptions to the rule. Moreover, blood contains ectoplasm, which can be separated and used for manifestations. This is why primitive people use blood as an offering, to manifest lower-level deities. It is a very dangerous endeavor to get involved in, dealing with these debased gods. Higher-level work uses the ethers released from volatile substances when they are burnt, hence the use of incense in magical work.
Avoiding sociopaths and rejecting immoral behavior is one thing. Tell me about some of the challenges one can be faced with, even when pursuing these arts out of good intent.
3 troubles can arise from ignorance and/or inexperience. Hypersensitivity, inability to break rapport after contact, and disassociation of the personality. First off, hypersensitivity is a real issue for those engaged in the work. Whatever system teaches the opening of the higher centers of consciousness should also teach their closing. This is done by setting a time limit on the opening of the doors and techniques like fixating on mundane tasks to close them. This is why many schools have included some type of craft work. Also, diet plays an important part, and a vegetarian one leads itself to sensitive states. The only problem is Western occultists who remain in the mix of everyday life do not do well exposed to the fracas in a perpetually sensitive state. Also understand that the goal is expanded consciousness, not a disharmony that works against it. There's a big difference between the expanded consciousness of the practitioners and the sensitivity of the psychic. One uses active force on the mental plane, the other drawing from receptive force on the astral, or the plane of emotions. The psychic and mystic often question why the science is necessary if they already have the gift of vision. Our reply is that knowledge and technique and psychology of the higher consciousness will keep that vision unimpaired and keep them away from the types of dangers in which they may have yet to face. Another issue is breaking rapport with a group once established. The phenomena of rapport amongst a group can either be helpful or harmful. It's like a blood transfusion, where the strength of one can supplement the weakness of another. As a side note, the real value of marriage involves the effective rapport on all planes. On the other hand, for a toxic link to be broken, there must be a severing of all relations, and certain advanced techniques may need to be employed. In order to heal the aura, physical and mental health must be built up first. One must seek a time of emotional quiet. Nature is a good healer, and a strong vitality will strengthen the gate against invasion. The third issue is the tendency to become overwhelmed and lost in an abstract world when one skips the step of knowing thyself. Introspective work is important, and areas of study like psychology can help. Without a solid vessel, the voyager can quickly find himself at the mercy of the wind and seas. The sensitivity of the psychic can turn into mental instability under adverse circumstances. One needs to grasp certain philosophies that make the initiatic schools complete. Occultism is simply the science of higher consciousness, and unless we come to certain realizations, this association of the personality remains a threat.
Do you use your skills on other people without their knowledge? Let's say you see someone suffering. Do you see it as your responsibility to help the otherwise helpless?
The realization of the power of thought is known to many. Some people seek to do good to others and protect them from harm using concentrated thought. But how far is one justified in interfering with others? Consider the orthodox thinker who would seek to help the esotericist by saving their soul from damnation and concentrating on them and giving them telepathic suggestions. That is unsolicited help, so the same would apply if the shoe was on the other foot. Is there anybody who has sufficient wisdom to know the needs of another soul? There is but one way to apply healing to someone else, and that is through invocation of God's love and guidance. I say, help those in need, but work through understanding and do not try to force your way.
So, jumping back, you said you don't recommend a vegetarian diet for the Western initiate because of sensitivity issues in a hectic society. I found this interesting because I'm a firm believer in the balance of mind, body, and soul. Why the disdain for vegetarianism?
Not disdain, but just objection to the idea that vegetarianism is required for the raising of consciousness. It is true that a vegetarian diet increases sensitivity of the nerves, but it is not a necessity and can even become counterproductive in some cases. There were plenty of enlightened masters who were not vegetarians. This training needs persons in good health, and they should not abandon a mixed diet under false pretenses. We should be cautious of extremes of any sort. There are those who take things up out of a fad, and it is okay to explore new things, but above all, we should discover our own unique natures, not be misled by a false requisite. Then, there is others who follow a vegetarian diet from a humanitarian standpoint. We know of examples in the Eastern schools which go to great lengths in preserving life of even an insect. What should our attitude be as seekers of light coming from the Western path? We should look as far as the master of compassion. You see, the world is full of things we should transcend from. War, prisons, the burden of man earning his living through the sweat of his brow, all types of suffering. We should not become fixated on an abstract right, but a practical one. As stated before, esoteric paths focus on extending consciousness, but there are two ways of obtaining perception of the subtle vibrations: increasing the sensitivity of the receiving instrument, or, as we do, by magnifying the vibrations. A vegetarian diet works by sensitizing a person, but a gentle environment must come with that. Our cities and culture in the West do not favor this state of being. But if a person wants to eliminate the consumption of meat, let it be out of preference and not fetish. Our brand of the use of the secret knowledge needs to rely on fact and not appeal. It has yet to free itself from the trammels of the Middle Ages, hung up on pre-Draconian methods, depending on argument and authorities rather than experiment and observation. I am an advocate of good ethics, but those ethics should be sane and practical. This is the sacred science.
I have a feeling that the esoteric world is as diverse as the mundane. You seem to embrace the diversity and encourage the seeker to find answers within their own culture, for them to go with what they know. Do esoteric groups from different cultures trade notes or influence each other?
The West is not the only part of the world where the secret knowledge is found. Many cultures have their own tradition, guarded wisdom, revealed to the few and concealed from the many. The West traces its origins to Egypt, with a nod to Chaldea, Greece, and the fierce Norse tradition. It comes down to us from the Kabbalists and alchemists, but it is the Eastern methods and terminology most known to the public for two reasons. One, the Western tradition is highly secretive, and two, the Theosophical Society's methods and contacts were Eastern. Why did Blavatsky take her initiation in the East? Because Russians are the most Westernly of Easterns, not the most Easterly of the Westerns. Different schools develop different brands using the knowledge, each bringing their own dish to the table. You have different cultural temperaments and their own unique duties. Beauty from Greece, order from Rome, spiritual philosophy from India. The pagan faiths of the West developed the nature contacts. The Eastern tradition has a very highly developed metaphysics. The secret teachings of the East are very valuable, but when it comes to practical application of these principles, it is best for one to follow their own culture's evolution. It would be like applying an Eastern approach to agriculture in the West. Conditions are different and the techniques will need to be modified. Eastern practitioners open to higher states of consciousness through chakras, or endocrine glands. Changes in consciousness are brought about by changing the chemical composition of the blood. This is achieved by stimulating these ductless glands. What some people fail to realize is that the composition of each race's endocrine system varies greatly. Methods which suit one can shatter another. The Western system of initiation focuses on strengthening, not sensitizing the candidate, and then concentrating the subtle forces by means of ritual. Unless a person has the right fundamentals established, the outcome would lead to weedy-looking neurotics common in esoteric circles. When these systems are transplanted in foreign lands, they rarely take plant, but remain superficial and academic. Equally do these considerations apply to Western occult systems which are transplanted to America. There is a certain aspect of esoteric work which makes use of magnetism of the land itself. Native systems of magic are built on this basis and have techniques for dealing with it. American occultism will never come into its own until it ceases to import its systems from Europe and India, but goes back along the line of its own tradition, picking up the aboriginal contacts and daring to bend them to its own evolutionary purpose. It must seek the contacts of the Sun Temple of Atlantis through the Maya tradition. Egypt has no message for the United States. Americans can learn esoteric philosophy and science from the Western tradition, just as the Europeans can learn from the Eastern tradition, but the initiatory forces cannot be conveyed across the Pacific and Atlantic.
Let's say someone has a calling to join an esoteric school and are unsure on which direction to go. Or maybe they found a group and want to make sure it's the right fit. What would you tell the honest seeker?
When the seeker of truth finds an esoteric philosophy to be a valid explanation of life, and the way of initiation satisfies their soul, what is the next step? First of all, they will have a wide range of literature and eventually find different groups to choose from. They should look for three things: the right principles, genuine knowledge, and a strong foundation. In being a novice, they will have to trust their common sense and not withhold inquiry. A good teacher will not object to being examined and will actually want to offer clarity. Likewise, if the pupil did not have a certain level of reasonable discretion, they would be shown a degree of carelessness and lack of common sense. Common questions arise like, is the school in line with their spiritual values? Is it dangerous? Is money required? Concerning money, material costs are a fact of life, but the expenses should be moderate. There's a difference between a money-making affair and normal operational costs. Then the school must be pure and clean. These sciences, when magnified under experiment, unless properly controlled, do undoubtedly act as stimulants to the baser aspects of human nature, like self-aggrandizement and lust. The seeker should look for qualities that align with their own. How do their members act? Does its leaders display intelligence and integrity? Perhaps surprisingly to some, they should be looking for more common virtues rather than esoteric displays of wonder. All phenomena are closely guarded by the true adept, who does not use them as cheap tricks to win followers. The power to perform phenomena is not proof of integrity. A person can be a very great psychic and also a very great deceiver. The thing which is of great power in this work is not the power to display marvels, but the insight of the significance of life and the universe. The marvels are a byproduct of the real work, and the true adept is interested in those who seek these greater truths. Lastly, the seeker may find disgruntled ex-members who left the group and claim the school to be a farce. The seeker should not ignore this information, but look to find both sides of the story. Was the school not up to par, or did the student fall short, get burned by the powerful work, and fail to look within? Three things are necessary for the safe travels in this path: a living spiritual faith, a level head, and sound knowledge of the psychology of the subconscious mind.
So you explained the history, explained how the mind is capable of expanded states, and how we can approach this in a modern way. You touched on the mistreatment and misrepresentation of these concepts, and you stated your goal was to have contact with higher intelligence beyond. Can you expand on that and explain what happens when it is carried out successfully?
The potential of the sacred science is great when applied in the light. Her secrets are not penetrated by study alone, but through direct experience. There is but one true path to initiation, and this is the path of immemorial tradition beaten by countless feet. The initial routes may be different according to cultural background, but they all come together forming one broad highway after the outer gate is passed. The way of initiation is not a mundane organization, but a psychic method leading to spiritual realization. The schools of this tradition train pupils so that those pupils may better serve God. They do not teach their secret methods of extending consciousness and acquiring domain over the unseen to those who are simply curious and ambitious. The adept, who is the servant of the great initiator, trains pupils to serve a greater good, the service to which he himself is dedicated. That service has many subdivisions, and special aptitudes are required for different branches of the work. The largest branch of effort focuses on the material plane of our common societies. The Logodial mind is constantly evolving new ideas. Those ideas are received intuitively by the enlightened beings who have advanced beyond their incarnation cycles. They then pass those ideas to the adepts. The initiated pupils serve as the earthward end of a living chain of consciousness. These Logodial ideas are lived out as archetypal ideals implanted in the group mind. Although the initiates are tasked with implementing them, all those who are willing to hear are in cooperation. Another branch of work is carried on by those who undertake no mundane task at all, but live in seclusion, occupied solely with mental work. They perform the same function for the community as the contemplative orders perform for the Roman Church. They are a mighty, though invisible, source of energy. Their efforts are towards the collective, not the individual. It is the efforts of these mental workers, visualizing ideals and neutralizing evils, which steadies the nations. Another branch I will cover is the police or ambulance workers of the inner planes. Their jobs are to combat black practitioners and deal with the problems created from abuse of the esoteric knowledge. This organization is highly developed, though these individuals seek to avoid attention rather than attract it. These groups refrain from all other interference except for crimes committed on the mental planes. They keep track of offenders and report them to those on the mundane plane who are in a position to cope with them. And so the work of the world gets done.
We advance. And how would I recognize one of your own?
They are distinguished from the unenlightened not by their clothes or habits, but by their mentality. Two qualities characterize them: their serenity and their courage. The neophyte's training is designed to make them strong, but with a heart of compassion. They are first given the metaphysics of the science and then taught the symbols, which represents thought forms, not artifacts. Just as the king of the world and his subordinates are forces, not deities. The initiates are instructed to stay within their common society to maintain a connection with the group mind. They serve a greater good and are otherwise carefree, knowing their needs will be taken care of. The child in them remains unrepressed, and when they relax the bent bow of their psychism, they revert to that child. This is very characteristic of the true adept, and this is what separates them from the charlatan. The adept should have the trifecta of mystic devotion, occult wisdom, and the primitive nature forces, that is, the spiritual, intellectual, and elemental. The character of the adept could be summed up in one phrase: they are a soldier scholar dedicated to the service of God.